Hello and welcome back to the NBA podcast. I am your part-time host, I suppose your once-a-month host, Jack Quantrill, and today marks a very cool moment in my podcasting career. I'm speaking to Coach Dave Love, the NBA shooting coach. You might have heard of his podcast. You might follow him on Twitter. He is one of the very best people out there in terms of not just sort of coaching NBA level players and international players on their shooting form and sort of working with them to help them become better shooters, but I think he's really leading the charge in educating younger coaches, coaches that might coach at younger levels on how to develop how they coach shooting and how to sort of bring everyone along, not just the very elite. So, Dave, thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing
My
today, man?
pleasure. I'm very well. I'm looking forward to a great conversation. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. And today, I think that we went over this pre-pod. The idea is to talk about the mental side of what you do, because a lot of NBA fans might think of a shooting coach as a guy that, sorry for the people that aren't watching this episode, say, put the elbow here, have the hand here on the ball, etc. And it's align your feet with the basket, and it's all quite physical. But I think that we've seen tons and tons of players. For them, it's a mindset, it's a mentality. They might have the best mechanics in the world, but if they're not confident letting the ball fly, then that's not really going to have an impact in the NBA game. So, Dave, to sort of start us off, do you want to give us an idea of what your job looks like when it comes to developing a player's mental approach? Because we might be quite comfortable with the physical idea, but when you start working with an NBA player, an international player, how do you start trying to think about maybe changing their mindset or altering their mindset a little bit to make them a better shooter?
There are a lot of things that go into that, and
Hmm.
and I think the initial step is to create a safe space for that player.
Right.
That they, especially the players that I work with, which tend to be the weaker shooters. Thus, they're working with the shooting coach.
Yep.
They have probably struggled with this skill their entire life, and they have probably had everybody in their life giving them advice, and giving them encouragement in sometimes less than polite ways. And they're having to face the fact that now somebody else, usually I'm hired by a team, that
Yep.
team wants them to improve this skill. And so I've got to create an environment where it's okay for them to be vulnerable,
Mm.
because one of the first things that is going to happen is, in a relatively simple environment, um, I may ask them to do a certain drill, and they may airball a shot in a relatively simple situation, like a very simple drill.
Mm.
And uh, and I've got to create an environment where they feel safe doing that in front of me, who I may still be a stranger to them at that point,
Yep.
um, and in front of all the other people that are watching, and then create an environment where they know that that's just the first step in their journey. That's not an indictment. That is just where we're beginning, and as long as we work, we'll make progress.
And I think it must be hard because I'm someone that loves sort of the draft side of the game and scouting. And often when you listen to a podcast or an analyst talk about these things, they say, if you want to become an NBA player, you better have some arrogance about you. You better have some self confidence and some bravado. So while you might speak to someone off the court and they're sort of shy and retiring, once that player steps foot on the court, they need to believe that they deserve to be out there and that, they're one of the best players in the league in some cases. So to sort of come in and ask for them to get around that and sort of say, yeah, I really believe in my game. I know what I'm about. I know I deserve to be here, but I also know that I need to get better at this thing that could potentially make me a lot of money or could potentially sort of lead to big developments for my team or in my personal life. It's definitely a big sort of challenge, I suppose. So once you've made that safe space and once you've sort of got accustomed to rhythms of how a player likes to work and how they like to communicate. I was wondering, in an age of analytics where I can go on NBA.com and I can see where any player in the league shot, what percentage they shot from the left corner, the right corner, above the break, when they had a guy sort of closing out in their face, when they were completely wide open. I'd love to know how aware players are of their percentages, because from an analyst's point of view, I might look at a shooter and say, oh, 34% from three. He might not get guarded in the playoffs. 37% from three. Oh, that's great. He's a bucket. We can trust him to get them up all day long. But in reality, during a NBA game, you might only see that variance over the course of sort of a 3-4 game stretch. So are players really caught up in their percentages? And do you need to move them away from the result towards focusing on the process?
Well, whether they're aware and whether they'll admit
Hmm.
depends on the player. That there are players who are hyper aware
Yeah.
of their statistics. There are players who are hyper aware but won't admit to. They think you don't know, and so
Yeah.
I'll always, at some point in a an early conversation, ask, uh, uh, what do you shoot from the free throw line? What did you shoot from three? I already know the answer, but
Yeah.
I'm curious what answer they're going to give me. And there are some players who are very honest and say, "Oh man, I think I was like 52% from the free throw line. Like that's why I'm here." There are others who will pad their statistics by as much as 15 or 20%, or
Wow.
will cherry pick that one great season that they did shoot 80% from the line. It was on 5 attempts, but it really depends on the player. And so I'm assessing how do they view themselves,
Mhm.
and then how honest can I be with them. Eventually, I need to work my way to being completely honest with them, but that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that you necessarily start there. You have to, again, earn their trust. But um, once you've got that, then you talked about knowledge of process and knowledge of results, which is a cueing idea, like how we talk to players, what we
Yeah.
draw their attention to. Do we want to draw their attention to the result of shots in a meaningless, or the meaningless result of shots in a workout in the middle of June?
Mhm.
Or do we want to bring their attention to the process that will help them get better results through that work? And so that's where I try and focus attention, especially within a workout, is bringing their attention to the process that will help them improve.
Yeah, I completely get that. And I think that if you listen to sort of any piece of sports coverage, you'll hear it's a results based business within about, 2-3 minutes of putting anything on. So it must be really hard to sort of work on that rewiring. Um, One of the things that I wonder about, I got to speak to Seth Partnow a little while ago back in London. He was in England. It was fantastic. I sort of stalked him down at a conference that I was going to and said, "Hey, you're the only guy here that likes basketball. Everyone else is here for football or soccer. Please talk to me." And I remember him bringing up Kevin Garnett, and he said that if you ask Kevin Garnett to take a 22-foot jump shot, he'd knock it down no problems. But he perhaps had a little bit of a mental block with the 3-point line, the idea of sort of stepping back behind the breach. And especially back then, the idea of a big man doing that, it was almost viewed as soft. I think Garnett got a lot of abuse early in his career for, oh, you
Right.
favor the fadeaway. You don't like to sort of like elbow someone in their face and dunk all over them. Do you find when you go in and you coach people that they might have that sort of mental block where the 3-point line is still a bit of an issue, or do you think in an era where a lot of players have grown up watching Steph Curry, Dame Lillard, James Harden, are players more and more comfortable from behind the arc now, even if they're not necessarily getting the results that their team wants just yet?
Yeah, I think we've definitely trended towards the latter, where people are more comfortable, but it can be a case by case basis, and then there can be a physical limitation. as well, where the NBA 3-point shot is a challenging shot.
Hmm.
It is far longer than the casual basketball fan gives it credit
Mm.
for being, and it's an adjustment coming from college to the NBA, and now the line is 2.5 feet or however much further back. But
Yeah.
I find that most players in this day and age are wanting to shoot the three, and almost to the point now where the most common challenge, certainly not the only challenge, but
Yeah.
the most common challenge is reducing the functional task difficulty, or getting them to buy into reducing the functional task
Right.
difficulty. They want to jump to the end result. Well, I want to become a 3-point shooter. Well, that's great. You're not capable of making a free throw 60% of the time right now. So we may need to work on improving habits closer to the rim than 24 feet. And a lot of, especially young players, might not understand that process, and so that's a lot of my job with younger players, or new players, is to help them understand why we're doing things the way that we are, and why you don't just jump to the 3-point line when you want to become a better 3-point shooter.
I mean, Steve Kerr was arguably the best 3-point shooter statistically of the, let's say the 1990s. I know that other guys got him up at higher volume, but he, I believe, always used to start his workout sort of from like 12 foot, 8 foot out and just work his way back just to sort of develop that feel, make sure that the form is feeling solid. And, if Steve Kerr can do that, a guy that shot over 50% from three in an NBA season,
Right.
I think that should serve as some pretty good, like, look, they all do it. It's fine. I mean, even Steph in his pre-game warm-ups, you see him sort of start from the floater line and maybe work his way back too. So it must be quite difficult to sort of emphasize how much work has gone into making these sort of elite 3-point shooters, and how if I was a elite basketball player and I struggled from the 3-point line, I might think that some guys just have it and some guys don't. But the reality of it is thousands and thousands of hours and repetitions and sort of hours with the hand in the basketball has gone into getting where they are. So do you ever find it hard to sort of get past that? No, I'm not a 3-point shooter. That's not my game.
Um, yeah, for different players, that can absolutely be a challenge.
Mhm.
Um, I think the biggest hurdle to overcome, just generally, like in all these things, that all these different aspects that we're talking about, is just the honesty of where that player is right now in their career, and what is possible on what kind of a timeline. and
Sure.
and I'll never put a limit on somebody and say like that, okay, you're a 55% free throw shooter right now, and not allowed to shoot threes. Let's um, I'll never put the limit of say you can't become somebody like Steph Curry, but I'll be very realistic about saying what our first goal is,
Mm.
and when I think that might be attainable, uh, and I'll be very cautious with that goal, because I'd far rather somebody exceed expectations um, than fail to meet them. And so I'll say, let's just get comfortable from the free throw line. And if by the end of the season, we can just show improvement from the free throw line, whatever that number is, then great. We've got the thing trending in the right direction. And in the back of my mind, I I might have the goal of, I want us to be a 70% free throw shooter. I want us to be a 35% 3-point shooter on open catch and shoots. Maybe I verbalize that, maybe I don't. Um, but I'll probably be fairly cautious with the goal that I'm giving to the player.
when I've listened to your podcasts in the past, you've spoken about sort of your journey and how your approach has changed over your career. And one thing that's really sort of stood out to me is this move away from what I think you call block practice, where uh, sort of amateur basketball players, they might find that before a session ends, their coach says, go and hit 20 shots from the free throw line. You can't leave until you make 20 in a row, restart if you miss one. And it's sort of the same position every time. Or maybe it's a corner three where you'll throw a guy 50 passes and they're taking 50 corner threes. And, the shot is, the pass rather is always right in the pocket. And you spoke about how you've tried to move away from that and how to sort of get players on the move, get players making decisions. And I don't know if you called it randomizing practice, but sort of adding in different layers of difficulty and variation. Talk to me a little bit about that, and talk to me about how you might go about sort of telling a player, no, the coaching that you've got on this in the past might not be too up to date. I'd like you to do this.
Yeah, what you described as an amateur player, the challenges that they might face, that happens in the NBA all the
Sure.
time. That I think we're on the doorstep of a massive revolution in coaching in the NBA,
Mm,
where in the past, far too many of us, myself included 10 years ago, had no concept of research into how people learned a skill. And we were doing things that made logical sense, but might not have been supported by evidence. And so we did things like, hey, repeat the same perfect movement over
yes.
and over and over again in a simple non-game like environment, and that will transfer. You'll then be able to do the perfect thing in a game like environment, and that's not actually how we learn, especially when the game is random. Um, and and this took me, I really started to embrace this idea of the science of skill acquisition and the constraint-led approach and an ecological dynamics approach. Um, I really started to embrace that probably in about 2018-19,
Right.
and it probably took me till about 2021 to get comfortable using any of these ideas. And I'm still not an expert. Don't claim to be, but to get a player, um, I I haven't found it to be too challenging.
Okay.
That when you can explain to a player like, hey, we're not going to do spots where you get to shoot the same 10 shots over and over and over again, and then you move to another spot and shoot another 10 shots over and over and over again. Instead, we're going to practice like this for this reason, where we change spots because I need you to be able to adapt.
Mm,
The No two shots are going to be the same in a game. The biggest skill a shooter needs to have is the ability to adapt in a changing environment. And so we're going to practice like that. And and I've been pleasantly surprised that players have bought into that fairly quickly. And the other piece that helps is it's a lot more fun once they start to understand that the drawbacks of standing in the same spot.
yeah.
There's a comfort zone in that, but they start to realize or recognize the boredom that goes along with it, and the mindlessness. And mindlessly doing something usually means boring. Being challenged usually means enjoyable. And so we're searching for the challenge.
I think it's interesting that the NBA has almost mirrored the change in your approach, where sort of pre or around 2018, there was a definite fear that D'Antoni Houston Rockets ball would become prevalent in the NBA, and you'd have one guy operating at the top of the key, isolating 60, 70 times per game, and then everyone does shoot from those spots. But ironically, as your approach has changed, the NBA's approach has changed to where players are on the move now far more, and they will see more variance in the looks that they're getting. And I think that that's only going to continue as the game progresses and continues to quicken and put the ball in more players' hands in more different positions. So it would have always been important to do it that way, but it's almost as though it's becoming more important by the day, right?
Right. Yeah. Tactically, things are always going to evolve and change and ebb and flow where somebody will find a tactical advantage,
Hmm.
and then somebody else will find a way to negate that. And so now there will be a new tactical advantage, and can you find that? And so that's always how, like, I won't be surprised when one day a team features two big men
Hmm.
again in a in an evolved twin towers kind of
Yeah.
situation, and they will find an advantage, and it will start because they have two elite big men, just the way that Golden State started, um, with two elite shooters, and so um, your personnel will play a huge role in determining the direction that you go, and then whether you can find the advantage based on what your personnel is. That's the trick.
I think there's an argument that it's already really swinging back quite hard in that direction. I was watching some of the OKC Thunder's first preseason game yesterday against the San Antonio Spurs, and while the Spurs last year chose to bench Zach Collins in favour of playing Wemby at the five and sort of really leaning into giving him as much space as possible, the Thunder made a really splashy acquisition by bringing in Isaiah Hartenstein and sliding Chet Holmgren down to the four in some lineups, and they were just able to completely shut the rim off with those two. And I think that a lot of the focus of NBA analysts and people that maybe want to really get into the sport on a professional level is about this advancement on the offensive end. And everyone's sort of saying, no, you should play with a completely spaced out team. You should have a five that can launch from 30 feet away. But really the defensive side factors in so much as well, to where it might not always be a team's job to provide the most favorable offensive environment. It might be, can we provide one that allows us to get those two bigs on the floor, or maybe three guys that can really protect the rim one day. We'll see how far it's ever pushed. But yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head where you say it's ever changing, and your practice as a result has to change with that as well. um One thing that I would have been wary of with spot practice and, let's say, the traditional approach is,
Mhm.
when I listen to NBA players talk on podcasts, maybe they've retired, they say, you don't realize what percentage players shoot when they're in the gym, when they're playing pickup. They
Yeah.
make 70-80% of their shots all the time. You always see highlight videos during the off season of a sort of 7 foot big man that's never trusted to have the ball in his hands. He'll be launching step back threes when he's playing pickup. Um, do you ever find in your practice, when a player's maybe nearer the end of their journey, that you've really seen the progress in a practice setting, but it translates a little slower into an in-game setting?
Um, Sorry, ask that one more time.
So yeah,
I just want to make sure I understand where you're going.
so what I'm trying to get at is this idea that it's sort of said to fans that NBA players never miss in practice. And one thing that I'd be really aware of, so I'm a teacher now, I'm going into teaching. And one thing that I'm going to say in my class all the time is, I want you to get things wrong. And for
Right.
an NBA player, it's just as important being able to be comfortable missing and sort of keep your volume up, stay aggressive, as it is to make as many threes as possible. So do you ever see that a player will make real progress in a practice setting where the percentages improve, the form looks a lot better, but it takes a lot more time to translate over to a real sort of live game environment?
Yeah, especially with the way that practice is being done at the NBA level right now,
Yeah.
where we have some really um, uh, quality coaches, and we have a lot of younger, inexperienced coaches or former players who are just entering into coaching.
Yeah.
And so those two groups, the last two groups of the young video coordinators who this is their first coaching job, but and the former players, they end up doing what they were asked to do as players, and it ends up being a lot of spot shooting. And so
Yeah.
it's relatively easy to get a improved result as long as you're just allowed as a coach to simplify the situation until we get the result.
Mm.
That makes our job really, really easy. And I can remember my mentor sharing with me early on in my career, like, you hold yourself accountable to getting results in games. Don't fall back on, well, he's shooting 80% from three in an empty gym with perfect chest passes every single time.
Yeah.
Um, and so, like, I remember having a conversation with a um, famous shooting coach that's more of an Instagram celebrity.
Yeah.
And he was at one end of the floor doing a workout with a player, and I was doing a workout with another player at the other end of the floor, and we just met and chit chatted. And he was talking about his player that's saying that you know my guy just doesn't get it. Like, I can get him to do these things in the workout, and he just
Yeah.
doesn't do them in a game. And in my head, I was just thinking, yes, it's our job to make them get it. It's not his fault that he doesn't get it. It's the way that the way that we're practicing. And I've certainly been um, early on in my career, I made that mistake myself, but thankfully I had the mentor challenging me with, no, you haven't done your job yet. If you can't do it in a game, you're not done. And and I think that's the kind of accountability we need to hold ourselves to.
Yeah, I think when I'm singing in the shower, I sound pretty good, but I wouldn't be confident
Mhm.
to get up on stage and sing in front of 1,000 people. And I think that it can maybe be the same thing. And it kind of,
I'm a great
yeah.
golfer on the driving range.
Oh, same here, man. Same here. Um, it kind of comes back to what we were talking about at the top of the pod, where we spoke about this challenge of gaining the trust of a player, providing that safe space. And when I brought up that idea of bravado, it might be quite tough to deal with an NBA player where you're saying, "No, I want you to miss shots. That can lead to improvement. I want you to challenge yourself and I want you to test yourself because we want to see the ball go in every time. It releases that little bit of dopamine. You feel good about
Right.
yourself. You feel like you're making that progress." So, will you ever really sort of ramp up the difficulty for a player if you find that like it's they're starting to get the easy stuff now, but I need to remind them you need to feel confident doing this in a game with a hand in your face with 2 seconds left on the shot clock in a pressured environment. Do you ever how do you keep players comfortable with missing at all times?
It starts by seeing the miss as a positive thing.
Right.
The miss, number one, is always going to happen.
Mm.
That even the best shooters in the world in games miss shots. We are going to do that as well. And there's information to be learned from the missed shot that that information, depending on where you miss, how it feels coming out of your hand, that can give you a clue as to what habits you might still have that are causing the misses. And if we can learn what those are, then in theory we can reduce the number of misses. We'll never eliminate them, um, but I think we need to plant the seed with players that that those misses aren't a negative.
Hmm.
You're a human being trying to do a really, really hard skill and in a really, really hard environment. The fact that we ever make a shot is actually quite amazing. Um, but uh, but then flip it around to say, like, okay, good. What do you feel? Can you fix that? Can you get better at that?
Mm.
Okay, good. Show me. Um, it's a positive thing, and it means typically we're practicing in a more game-like environment or a more challenging environment, and therefore uh, it's the habits that we're working on are going to transfer to a game better. That doesn't mean that it's going to be 100% game-like or game representative, but that we're closer than we could have been if I just simplified everything so that you never missed or rarely missed.
I I think that you sort of mentioning what did you feel from that shot? What felt wrong? What felt right? How can we improve on that? Sort of brings us to another thing that we discussed pre-pod that I wanted to get into, and that's the idea of unless you are the creme de la creme of basketball players, you likely have never worked with a shooting coach. You've likely never had someone sort of dissect your jump shot, watch it on film 500 times, and then tell you you need to be doing this, 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 and that, etc. But the closest thing certainly sports fans might have is the dissection of their golf swing. If they go to the driving range, like you mentioned earlier, or they're getting a lesson from a former pro, a lot of the time when I'm watching stuff on Instagram and it's like make sure that you've got 60% of your weight on your left leg and you're sort of leaning forward and you're making sure to shallow the club so your approach angle is this, etc. It's mind-boggling. And one thing that sort of gets around that, one thing that eases cognitive load, which is another thing that you've spoken about on your podcast previously, is the idea of a swing thought where I know that I've got to change 10 things about my golf swing, but for this one, I'm just really going to focus on keeping my head down and bending my left knee to make sure that I make good contact with the ball, for example. And I wondered how much that transfers over to your job when you're coaching a basketball player. Could be very easy for someone of your talents to look at a player's jump shot and do the whole Instagram golf pro thing where it's, I want you to do this, 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 and this. But in order to get these improvements, I'm pretty sure you can't tell a player to focus on 7 things per shot. So could you give us a little bit of an insight onto the shot thoughts equivalent for a basketball player? What do you work on from that point of view?
I had a transformative moment as a coach,
Hmm.
uh, probably 20 years ago now, where I had been working as a shooting coach for the local university team, doing clinics for kids. I was starting to become professional-ish
Yeah.
at my coaching, and I went to the driving range, and I liked to sit or to position myself near somebody doing a lesson, partly so that as a golfer I could pick up a tip or two,
Right.
listening in on the pro teaching somebody else, and then partly so that I could just hear somebody else's coaching. And this one particular day, there was a middle-aged woman who didn't play very much golf,
Hmm.
being taught by an older gentleman, and every time she swung the club, he gave her a different swing thought, a different part of her swing. So on swing A, he gave advice that, oh, on that one, you hit it fat. I want you to make sure that you keep your head level.
Yeah.
And so on swing B, she's probably thinking, okay, keep my head level, and then she duck hooks it. He's like, "Oh yeah, you closed the club face too much, so I really want to make sure that you whatever advice that he would get." So now
Hmm.
she transfers her thought to that piece of advice, and now she blades the next one. And he's, "Oh yeah, you got to make sure that you keep your head down,
Yeah.
that you don't lift up." And okay, so now she's thinking, keep her head, and every single swing she
Yeah.
got a new piece of advice, and she never got a chance to work on any of them. And I can remember thinking, I don't know if I do that as a coach, but I better make sure that I don't.
Sure.
And so my goal is to have a primary focus for a workout. We're just trying to work on this habit that
Hmm.
will get you the biggest, the quickest, or the easiest results. If we can improve this habit, then theoretically you're going to make more shots. Now that habit may encompass three different things, and it's my job as a coach um, to try put a, to put a bow on as many things so that the player really just has one shot thought, but that shot thought may cover a few different ideas, and ideally they don't even realize it. So part of what we're discussing should be internal and external cues, and for those that might not be aware, an internal cue
Mm.
is an idea that we give to the players relating to their body. So bend your wrist back, bend your knees, lift your elbow. It's about a specific body part. An external cue is more to do with an analogy, a feeling, or an image. And so feel like you're a waiter carrying a tray of drinks over your head. I want you to imagine growing roots into the ground. Um, those, when it's a complex movement, like shooting a basketball that has many different pieces, the external cues translate far better to than an internal cue. And so I'm just trying to use drills to help the player feel something, then create an external cue around that feeling, and then try to adjust the drills so the players are in the challenge point as often as I can possibly get them while exploring around that new feeling.
It's kind of like you said with the practice results. It's your job to get results in games, not in practice. And it's also your job. You might look at a player's shot and instantly diagnose this is what they're doing wrong. And you might be able to tell them all the little things that they're doing wrong and all the little things that they need to fix. But unless you can make them understand that, and unless you can make that easy for them to understand, they're never really going to improve. So it must be a massive part of it. Go for it. Go for it, Dave.
And to help them understand that without paralyzing them. So
Yes.
that's the other benefit of that, uh, or essentially the benefit of external cues is the overall feeling, focusing on that as opposed to the feeling of one particular part of the shot or one body part in the action that it should be doing in this holistic movement.
Yeah, and I think that that might be surprising to some people because I certainly thought before I started listening to your pod that feedback would be incredibly technical where and I'm sure at times it is, but you hear about the Toronto Raptors facility where they've got a machine that tells you the exact arc of the ball, the bit of the rim that it hit, the amount of spin that you had on the ball, and you maybe transpose it onto baseball where they know the exact sort of miles per hour that they're throwing, and they know, oh, my wrist did this, it sort of flared out too quickly on that one, I need to fix that. But I was listening to an Orlando Magic season preview pod, and this was on Hardwood Knocks, by the way. Brian Favali, go and check Brian out. He's great. He's been a previous guest on this pod and the Drop Step. Um, and the guest came on and said about Franz Wagner, who is an incredible NBA player and looks to have a really promising future. He signed a max contract this season, or an extension rather. And they said, yeah, they've brought in a shooting coach for Franz, and what I've heard is the swing thought is reach for the stars. He had a really, really sort of flat arc, and that was a little bit of an issue for him towards the end of the season where his percentages started to plummet a little bit. And it was just this idea of, no, I want your hand to finish high. I want you to feel like you're reaching for the stars on every single shot. And we're just going to try and fix that arc. And maybe the percentages don't swing round straight away. But once we get that, we can focus on the next part of the shot and we can start to really build towards something. So, yeah, I thought that that might be a fun example of just like you said with the waiter, carrying the drinks over. How much of your job is the really technical feedback, and how much of your advice is I'm trying to simplify this so you can think about it when you're shooting a basketball?
I mean, it's 50-50. For
Right.
me, I have to go as technical as I possibly can. And
Mm.
I'm doing research now into quantifying how people shoot the basketball. In much the same way that baseball has gone that direction, and golf has been there for 15 to 20 years now because they're easily quantifiable sports, being relatively stationary sports.
Mm.
I'm trying to understand shooting on that kind of a level, but then I need to know the details. But that doesn't mean that I need to be able to communicate all of those details to the player to prove how smart I am. I need to
Yes.
keep it as simple as I possibly can for the player. This is a challenging movement, and it's a constant balancing act of how much do I share, how much do I need them to understand, um, without paralyzing them with all kinds of different thoughts.
And I think that another maybe misconception from the fan side might be that if you're an incredible shooter, you probably know technically and you think about, oh, right, my elbow's there, etc. I'm doing all of this stuff right. And one of the best pieces of podcasting I saw earlier this year was on the JJ Reddick podcast before he got the LA Lakers job. And he had Cam Johnson of the Brooklyn Nets on, and they spoke about making movement threes when you're running or curling to your strong side. So for Cam Johnson, that is making a uh, running sort of curl three from the right hand side of the court when you've ran from left to right. And he spoke about all I think about with those shots is, you know, waiting for my elbow to come, or sorry, waiting for my shoulder to come round to be aligned with the basket. And then once I feel it's aligned with the basket, I know that I'm in line and I can sort of trust my built-in motion to get the ball there. And that's one of the more difficult things for NBA players to do because it's not quite as simple a weight transfer. Have you found that once players sort of reach the end of their journey with you, are they thinking about shooting from a really technical point of view, or do you try and leave them with just these simple thoughts of try and stay on that right track, try and focus on this stuff, try and feel good about your shot?
I mean, it really depends on the player, and
Mhm.
especially when I worked with them. So if you go back to Tristan Thompson in 2013, 14, before I
Yeah,
became aware of a lot of the science of skill acquisition ideas, I was probably teaching too technically.
right.
Um, and so if you asked him, he would say, "Oh yeah, no, Dave is really technical." My ultimate goal, I'm nowhere close to this. I don't think I'll ever get to this, but it would be
Mhm.
wonderful if a player were to say, um, "You know what? I don't even know what we're working on, but I know the feeling." Um,
Right.
as ridiculous as that sounds, and as uneducated as that sounds, I would take that as a huge compliment at this point in my career where a player can't even articulate necessarily what we're working on,
Yeah.
but they know the feeling that they've done it right, and they know the feeling of the mistake. That sounds to me like almost a perfect environment where they're not encumbered by all these different shot thoughts. We want to keep that laundry list as short as we can, and when they can just attach it to a feeling that they're trying to create, um, that's my ultimate dream that I'll probably never achieve. We'll probably never
Well,
get there. You do need to have a technical idea, and so I spoke about the internal and external cues,
yeah.
saying that external cues are better translate to a game. That doesn't mean that you'd never give an internal thought. I still start with an internal cue or an
Mm.
internal cue. I need to explain to the player what we're trying to do, and then I transition from an internal cue that makes sense to or an internal cue to an external cue that makes sense to me. This is how I've thought about it. This is how other players that I've worked with have thought about it. And then I try and transition to an external cue that makes sense to them. Okay, now you've had some time to think about this. How do you think about it? And eventually that becomes the cue that we use, the one that makes sense to their brain. But it doesn't mean that we start there. There's a learning process that goes into it.
Dave, I think once you get from that idea of the internal cue, the external cue to a player just feeling right, you said your ultimate aim, you need to change your handle from coach to like guru or shaman for these players. That's the ultimate goal in the end. I just want to feel right and I want to shoot well when I'm around Dave Love. I think I want to sort of close this podcast with a slight, not like crackpot theory, but it's something that I think would interest a lot of NBA fans, and it's something that we spoke about pre-pod. So um, earlier this year, Andy Murray retired from professional tennis, and it
Okay.
prompted a conversation around my house. Andy Murray, for those that don't know, Scottish tennis player, first Brit to win Wimbledon since I think 1936. Fred Perry, he won it back in 2012 and has won it a couple of times since. Represented Great Britain phenomenally well at the Olympic stage as well. And it got this conversation going in my house of who's the best British athlete of all time. And some people said Andy Murray, some people said famous footballers. They might have said Mo Farah, the distance runner, and my little brother said Roger Bannister, and we said, "Oh, that's interesting." Sure, a lot of people know the name Roger Bannister, but you know, he's certainly not got the medal tally. If it was a ring culture question, then that answer would have been sort of laughed out of the room. But for those that don't know, Roger Bannister was the first person in human history, while these things have been recorded, to run a 4-minute mile. And prior to Roger sort of breaking that barrier or running under the 4-minute mark, it was thought to be nigh on impossible. No one had done it before. These were professional athletes at the time. It just hadn't been done. And with the help of a pacemaker and the right conditions and the right stadium, Roger beat that time. He ran a 3:59 something and broke that incredible barrier. And after that, lots of runners have followed him since. It only took a couple of weeks for other people to go out there and run a sub 4-minute mile. And it just showed that it's the mental side often. It's not necessarily always the physical side. It's believing that we can do this thing. And I think now the record for a mile is somewhere in the 3 minutes 40 stages. So the time is just being chalked away at time and time again. But Dave, we spoke about Steph Curry potentially being that Roger Bannister of this generation of the NBA, where he completely redefined what was possible with shooting, what percentages were possible. I first want to ask you, what was your experience of that in the NBA? Because that must have changed the way you thought about basketball too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a question anymore. And this comes as a gigantic Larry Bird fan growing up.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think there's a question that he's the greatest shooter that's ever lived.
Mhm.
In game, like the degree of difficulty that he is forced to shoot, um, and and then and then still the percentages that he puts up is unbelievable. I can't imagine what um, if he got the open looks that some of the other great shooters uh, got. I
Yeah.
can't imagine what kind of percentage he would be shooting, which I think leads you into the question that I think you're going to ask.
Yes. So the question is another Roger Bannister on the horizon? Is another Steph Curry on the horizon? Where I looked at the numbers, and Reed Shepherd, for example, a new prospect coming into the NBA, shot 52% from three in his season at Kentucky last year. Drew Holiday shot 66% on corner threes last season for the Boston Celtics. Luke Kennard has regularly shot above 45% from three and sort of flirted with that 50 mark. Dave, do you think that it's possible that another player comes along and maybe retires the moniker of like 50, 40, 90 being the gold standard for a shooting season? Do you think that that could come, and what might that look like?
Well, I've wondered this. I smiled as we were talking about this before we started
Yeah.
recording, because this is um, a, a constant wonder of mine,
Mm,
whether we can have a 60% three-point shooter.
hmm.
Because um, now I've been trying to research and quantify shooting mechanics for about 4 years now.
Yeah.
Um, and in so doing, we've proven that some of the ideas, some of the hypotheses that I had on how we physically want to shoot the basketball, we've proven that some of those are correct.
Mhm.
And there was one in particular that I went into with the hypothesis of I want to prove this idea. And we actually found it to be incorrect. And we had to change the way that I've had to change the way that I'm coaching because the
Right.
evidence does not support this very common idea that you see all around Instagram and all around coaching of shooting. We have all of these debates. Should you point your toes at the target? Should you turn your feet to the guide hand side? Should the ball come off your middle finger, both fingers, or your index finger? Which finger should be on the middle of the basketball? Should we?
Yeah.
We have all these debates, and why are they debates? Because we don't know the truth. Why don't we know? Because we haven't been able to quantify and measure. Well, now I've gone down the road and I've learned
Mm.
some of these ideas, and I'm keeping a lot of them quiet because they're a competitive advantage for me, but
Yeah.
I'll share eventually. Um, and when we get out of the half the world is teaching shooting wrong, let's assume that half the people are teaching feet to the left as a right-handed shooter, and half the people are teaching 10 toes to the rim. One of those is more optimum, and
Yeah.
we each think that we're right,
Yeah.
but we don't know why. And so when we can learn why as coaches, when we can start to coach where more people are aware of science of skill acquisition idea, and then some version of Steph Curry grows up with that coaching,
Mm.
is 10% more? What if Steph is shooting a less than optimal way, but he mastered he repped out his shot,
Yeah.
which I'm completely fine with, especially with the results that he's gotten. But what if he could have been better had we just known what we will know 10 or 15 years from now, that some movements are more optimal than others?
I wonder. So I read Mike Prader's book last year, Spaced Out, and it's a great read. I'd recommend anyone listening to this podcast, anyone listening to a in-depth podcast about the art of shooting would enjoy Mike Prader's book. And the first chapter was on the introduction of the three-point line to the NBA. And Mike made the point that the 3 point line and the 3 point shot was referred to as the home run shot at its inception. And he then stated that because the term home run was used and because of the amount of home runs that are hit during a baseball game, that teams and players only shot, a couple of threes per game because they thought about them like home runs.
Right.
And once they got over that mental barrier, and now we're at almost like I think it's like a 43, 44% of our shots come from behind the 3 point line. It varies from each team. That's smashed offenses and it's completely changed the way that the game is played. I wonder if this anchoring towards 50, 40, 90, or 40% being the gold standard. You've sort of mentioned the physical ideas of we know we will find out what's optimum later down the line. I wonder if there's something in the brain kind of similar to that term of the home run shot where players, even the elite players in the world, hold themselves to that 50, 40, 90 standard. If that moniker didn't exist,
Yeah.
would players suddenly sort of like start to shoot past it because there's no like, oh, I've climbed Everest, I shoot 50, 40, 90. What if it was 50, 50, 60, 50, 95? Would we see players shooting differently?
Okay, so are we getting t-shirts made then, like the 95 60 60 club?
That's a good idea. I tell you
And
what,
then
I'll draw up some designs tonight. I'll get in touch with a couple of friends, and yeah, we'll get some merch out, Dave.
yeah, and then we've time stamped it that we essentially created those players when they happened just by manifesting this destiny. But I'm being silly, obviously,
Yeah.
but I think there's um, some validity in what you're saying. Absolutely.
Hmm.
It's been proven over and over with people like Roger Bannister, with Tiger Woods. I'm
Yeah.
sure we can come up with a million different examples of what he did in his sport.
Mm.
And so there's absolutely truth in what you're saying when you realize, oh, wait a second, we didn't realize that was possible. And from a physical, uh, from a learning, and from just a psychological standpoint, I think there's validity in all of that.
Guys, I think we're going to call that a podcast there. What a fun thing to end on. We'll have the t-shirt link in the bio. I might not be able to get them made up that quickly, but Dave, I've had a wonderful time talking about this stuff, and I hope that you guys at home have really enjoyed listening to our conversation here, where we've delved into the mental side of coaching shooting, and we've delved into what might be possible in the future. Have you got any closing thoughts, Dave, or have you got anything that you'd like to plug before we get on out here?
Yeah, you can find me on the Coach Dave Love podcast, or coachdavelove.com to sign up for my free shooting newsletter, or find me on social media at Coach Dave Love.
I just want to say I would really recommend going and checking Dave out. I had asked him to come on the pod a couple of months ago, and when our schedules aligned, I made sure to go and listen to his podcast. And even as someone that is not currently in the coaching game, maybe it's a long-term aspiration, it was really, really interesting to me as an NBA fan to hear about some of these things. And you can go along. And I think that one of the great things about your pod, Dave, is that while you've spoken about your development as a shooting coach, a lot of your episodes from January, March, April are still just as relevant today as they were when you released them, which means that, for me, if I talk about a trade rumor, you're not going to go back to it in a couple of months, but you've got this great back catalogue that you can go and listen to. Make sure to go and check out Dave. All of his links are below. And yeah, I've really, really enjoyed that episode. Make sure to rate the podcast if you enjoyed it too. Share it with a friend. Go check out Dave. Go check out the Drop Step YouTube channel. And make sure to tune back in for another episode next week of the NBA podcast. Thank you.